The sun dipped low across the glittering marina, casting golden ripples over rows of silent boats. Among them sat a magnificent white yacht, once the pride of its late owner, now a monument to frustration. For weeks, 30 of the city's best engineers had been summoned, each promising success, each leaving defeated. The wealthy widow, Mrs. Reynolds, stood on the dock with her arms folded, her patience worn thin and her pride wounded. Her sharp heels clicked against the wood as she barked orders to her staff, anger spilling from her like waves in a storm. 30 engineers, and not one could fix my husband's legacy, she cried, her voice echoing across the water. It was then that a shabby figure approached, carrying a worn toolbox. Samuel, a local mechanic known more for fixing bicycles and farm equipment than luxury yachts, had wandered by after a day of work. His clothes were faded, his hands grease-stained, and his eyes heavy with the quiet weight of a father trying to provide for 2 children on his own. Mrs. Reynolds caught sight of him and, in her bitterness, let out a sarcastic laugh. "And who are you supposed to be? Another so-called expert?" Samuel shifted uncomfortably, unsure whether to walk away. But before he could answer, she narrowed her eyes and mocked. "If you're so smart, why don't you fix my boat? Go on, show us what all these engineers couldn't do." The crowd chuckled at the absurdity. A poor mechanic against $1 million machine? Impossible. But Samuel didn't flinch. Her words cut deep, yet something inside him stirred, not pride, not anger, but the quiet voice of a man who had spent his whole life mending broken things with nothing but patience and love. He placed his toolbox on the dock. "Ma'am," he said softly, "I'll try." Samuel stepped carefully onto the yacht, its polished deck so different from the cracked concrete floors of the small workshop he called home. The elegant woodwork, the gleaming chrome, and the smell of salt in the air all seemed to whisper, "You don't belong here." Yet he pressed forward, setting his battered toolbox beside the enormous engine hatch. The wealthy woman stood with her arms crossed, watching skeptically. Behind her, a handful of dock workers smirked and whispered, certain that this poor mechanic was about to embarrass himself. But Samuel tuned them out. He had lived a life where people's doubts were louder than encouragement, and he had learned to work through the noise. With slow, steady hands he opened the engine compartment. The machine was a maze of wires, pipes, and polished steel. Most would see confusion, but Samuel closed his eyes for a moment and simply listened. The silence of the engine reminded him of countless nights spent fixing old radios by candlelight, of patching up his neighbor's tractors for little more than gratitude, of repairing his daughter's broken bicycle chain while she watched with hopeful eyes. He traced each line, each bolt, each gear, whispering to himself as if the machine were a living thing. "You've been hurt, but you can work again," he murmured. His fingers, rough and scarred, moved with surprising gentleness, as though he were comforting an old friend. Sweat beaded on his forehead. Hours passed. Tools clinked softly against metal. Every turn of a wrench carried with it not just skill, but years of perseverance born from necessity. For Samuel, this wasn't just about fixing a boat. It was about proving, perhaps to himself more than anyone, that even a poor man's hands, guided by patience and heart, could achieve what others deemed impossible. The marina had grown quieter as the hours slipped by. The sun had long set, and now the silver moon hung above, casting a soft glow on the still waters. Most of the workers had drifted away, yet a small curious crowd lingered, whispering in hushed tones. Samuel wiped his brow with the back of his hand. His shirt was damp with sweat, his knuckles scraped from stubborn bolts, but his eyes held the steady fire of determination. Piece by piece, he had retraced the heart of the engine, searching for what others had overlooked. Where the engineers had seen only complicated systems, Samuel had listened, to the faintest rattle, to the smell of burned oil, to the feel of resistance in a single stubborn gear. Finally, after hours of careful work, he tightened one last screw and sat back, exhausted. His breath came heavy, but his spirit felt light. He closed the toolbox, placed his hand on the engine, and whispered a prayer. "Please, don't let me fail." Mrs. Reynolds, arms crossed, raised an eyebrow. Well? Are you finished? Her tone was sharp, but beneath it was a flicker of curiosity she could not hide. Samuel nodded, climbed into the captain's chair, and slowly turned the key. For a moment, nothing. The silence stretched, and snickers rose from the dock. But then, with a deep rumble that grew into a thunderous roar, the engine came alive. The boat vibrated with power, lights flickered on, and the once lifeless yacht breathed again. Gasps filled the air. Some clapped, others simply stared. Mrs. Reynolds' eyes widened in disbelief. 30 engineers had failed. Yet this poor father, with worn tools and sheer persistence, had done the impossible. Samuel didn't smile. He simply whispered, "There you are, old friend. I knew you weren't finished yet." The engine purred steadily, its rhythm echoing across the marina like a triumphant heartbeat. The small crowd stood frozen in awe, as if they had just witnessed a miracle. Mrs. Reynolds, the wealthy widow who had mocked Samuel only hours earlier, stepped slowly toward the boat. Her sharp heels clicked against the dock, but this time her steps carried not arrogance, but hesitation. She looked at the mechanic, his clothes stained with grease, his face lined with exhaustion, his hands trembling slightly after hours of relentless effort. For the first time, she saw not a poor man, but a father, a human being who had poured his soul into reviving her husband's beloved yacht. Her voice cracked as she asked, How did you do it? 30 engineers, men with degrees, men with reputations, and yet you. She stopped, unable to finish. Samuel looked at her with quiet eyes, wiping his hands on an old rag. His answer was soft, almost humble, yet it carried the weight of truth. "Ma'am, those men tried to fix a machine. But I've spent my life fixing broken things with patience and heart. When you listen long enough, when you care enough, you start to hear what others can't." Her chest tightened. His words pierced through layers of pride and bitterness she hadn't realized she carried. All her life, she had believed skill came only with wealth, with education, with status. Yet here stood a man who had none of those things, and yet had achieved what others could not, because he worked not for glory, but with love. For the first time in years, tears welled in her eyes. She whispered to herself, almost in disbelief, "It wasn't genius that fixed my boat, it was humility." The night air felt different now, warmer, lighter, as the engine's steady hum filled the marina. Mrs. Reynolds stood silently, her eyes glistening in the moonlight. Around her, the crowd began to disperse, still whispering in amazement about the poor mechanic who had accomplished the impossible. She reached into her purse and pulled out a thick envelope. Stepping onto the boat, she pressed it into Samuel's hands. "Take this," she said softly. "You've earned every penny and more." Samuel looked down at the envelope, heavy with money, more than he had likely seen in years. For a brief moment, the thought of his children's hungry faces and worn-out shoes crossed his mind. But then, he slowly closed her hand back over it, and shook his head. "I didn't do this for money, ma'am," he said gently. "I did it because no machine deserves to be left broken, just like no person does." The words struck her like a chord, resonating deep within her. For the first time in years, she felt small, but not in a humiliating way. She felt humbled, awakened. This man, whom she had mocked, was richer in character than anyone she had known. Her voice trembled. "Then let me do something for you," she insisted. "Work for me. Maintain my estate, my cars, this boat. Not as charity, but because you are the only man I can truly trust." Samuel's eyes widened. He thought of his children, of nights when he skipped meals so they could eat. And now, in this moment, a door opened. Not just for survival, but for dignity and hope. Tears blurred his vision as he nodded. Mrs. Reynolds smiled for the first time in years, her heart softened. The boat's engine purred behind them, as if echoing the truth. Sometimes the greatest genius lies not in wealth or education, but in a humble heart that refuses to give up.